Okay, so on this Parsha of Ki Tavo, it follows Re'eh and Ki Teitzei, and if you remember, all of those Parshiot have to do with scores of laws that Moshe wants to present to the people who are about to go into Eretz Yisrael. That's the audience, the people who committed the sin of the spies 40 years before, have basically um, died out, although those who were less than 20 years old at the time this happened are still there. So, in other words, people who are about somewhere in their 50s, late 40s, or in their 50s, are the 10,000s of them are still there, and they're going to go in with all of the younger people of the new generation that was born during the 40 years in the desert. So there are some people who did actually remember Yetziat Mitzrayim personally because they were under 20. Um, but the majority of people are those who were born during the 40 years in the desert. These are young people, and these are the ones that are going to fight when they cross the Jordan and conquer the Canaanites and settle on the land. So Moshe is giving his sermons, his pep talks to this audience who are about to go in, and his themes are themes which are critical for the people to remember once they settle the land. And so in our parsha, I'm picking two of these ceremonies that Moshe is detailing to the people for the purpose of reminding them of how important gratitude is, their expression, their recognition, and their expression of gratitude to God for bringing them into the land, keeping his promise to the ancestors to bring the descendants of Abraham and Yitzchak and Yaakov into the land, and to give them a land which is Eretz Zavat Chalav Udavash, this blessed land that is going to make their living easy. And so Moshe is concerned that these people express gratitude and keep in mind the big picture of the whole purpose of Yetziat Mitzrayim was to bring the people into the land, and the whole purpose of the land is to keep the covenant that was made at Har Sinai. That is, we're going to be God's representatives, God's people, and he in turn is going to give us a land on which to establish our society and to live well. That's the big picture. But it requires the people remembering God and God's role and to express gratitude. So that's what these two topics that we're going to talk about, that's what this represents. Okay, the first topic is the first fruit ceremony. Now, um, on the one hand, we're going to look at its content, but on the other hand, remember through the year, I've been pointing out in many, many places how the Torah emphasizes certain things. In other words, the Torah is written without any um, bold print, without any italics. It's there, there's no way of knowing what the emphasis is if you're listening to the Torah. Remember, people didn't read, they couldn't read Paleo Hebrew, and they could only listen to it when it was read to them by Moshe or later generations by the scribes who could read this Paleo Hebrew of what the Torah was written in. And until the time of Ezra, I remember Ezra changed the Hebrew, the Paleo Hebrew, to Assyrian script. That's the script that we have now in our Torah. And he did that for the purpose of people being able to read the Torah themselves. because before that they couldn't read it themselves. They had to have somebody read it to them. But in any case, the Torah was learned audibly by hearing it. And so the literary form in the Torah very often uses methods to add emphasis to what it's saying. And it has two major ways of adding emphasis. One, we've talked about, is repetition. If a key word or a key phrase is repeated 3 times or 7 times, or mostly 14 times, if it's the most emphasis, then the people hear that. They hear the repetitions. So, a 3-time repetition may be like an underlined issue. If it's 5 times repetition or a 7-time repetition, then it's like it's in bold. And if it's a 14-time repetition, it's like it's standing out in big letters. So we're going to look at the repetition of key words in this ceremony because this is a ceremony in which the people, the farmer who brings this fruit to Jerusalem is going to declare, he's going to say. So these are Moshe's instructions when the people have settled the land, when they're on their own, each tribe has their own area of Eretz Yisrael, and they have now all established farmlands. Everybody had a farm because that's the way you ate, and you were able to support your family, and you also did trades with people with neighboring farms. So if they had a better crop of grapes, then you would get grapes. In return, you would give them maybe some wheat that you had good crops. In other words, there was a barter system. Um, on the one hand, that's the income that you would get, but you also grew things that you lived on. So everybody had farms to live on, except, by the way, very importantly, except the Levi. The tribe of Levi had no land and had no farms, and therefore had to be supported, as we'll see, had to be supported by the farmers. Okay, so, but we'll get to all of that. In any case, that's the way it worked. So now the Moshe's instructions. When you have entered the land, God, and I'll put this in different colors. The word God is in red, and the land God is giving you is in green, so that you can count if you want how many times you're going to see these expressions. When you have entered the land God, your God, is giving you as an inheritance, and have taken possession of it and settled it. So now everybody has settled on their tribe's allotment. Take some of the first fruits of all that you produce from the soil of the land God, your God, is giving you, and put them in a basket. We'll explain how that works shortly. Then go to the place God, your God, will choose as a dwelling for his name. In other words, the place that there's going to be the sanctuary. They knew the Mishkan, but that the sanctuary is going to be established in a place that God will choose. There's no mention of Jerusalem in the Torah. Jerusalem was identified by David and Solomon later on in history. So now it says the place God will choose to put the Aron HaKodesh, where God's presence is going to be manifest, wherever that's going to be. Bring this basket to that place and say to the Kohen who is in office, the Kohen Gadol, who is the key Kohen in the office at the time. This is what the farmer has to say. I declare today to God your God that I have come to the land God has sworn to our ancestors to give to us. Then the priest takes the basket from the farmer's hands and puts it in front of the altar. There's no offerings. These are not korbanot. This is not a sacrifice. He takes the basket of fruit and puts it near the altar, and then the farmer has to make this declaration. He has to say this out loud publicly. My ancestor was a wandering Aramean. Now, if you recognize this, this is the paragraph, and we'll see why, that the rabbis have put in the center of the Haggadah of Pesach that is recited on the night of Chag HaPesach. This is the paragraph. Arami Oved Avi Vayered in Mitzrayim. I remember that. My ancestor was a wandering Aramean. He's talking about Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. All of them were nomads. They all came from Aram Naharaim. They all came from where Abraham came from. And he went down to Egypt. Now talking about Yaakov as the third generation, came down to Egypt with a few people, the 70 people of Yaakov's family, and lived there and became a great nation, powerful and numerous. So you're recounting the story of the people coming to Egypt and becoming a very large, numerous people. But the Egyptians mistreated us and made us suffer, subjecting us to harsh labor. Then we cried out to God, the God of our ancestors, and God heard our voice, saw our misery, toil, and our oppression. And so God brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, meaning with these miracles, with great terror and great signs and wonders. He brought us to this place. That's where they are now, and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Now I bring the first fruits of the land that God has given me. That's the declaration. He has to say this paragraph publicly out loud, and then place the basket before God, your God, and bow down before God. This is Moshe giving instructions. You place the basket down, you bow down, and then you and the Levites and the foreigners residing among you shall rejoice in all the good things God, your God, has given to you and your household. And then you're supposed to party. Everybody then makes a big party when this ceremony is over. Okay, and now, what's the big party? Because this takes place on Shavuot. And Shavuot is the time of the first fruits ceremony. And Shavuot is one of the three regalim, one of the three festivals that everybody should come down to Eretz Yisrael, to come down to Yerushalayim. And when you come to Yerushalayim on one of the three festivals, or on each of the three festivals, you bring a korban chagiga. A korban chagiga is a animal that is shechted. The parts are taken as they are for every sacrifice, but then the main meat of the animal that you bring for a korban chagiga is given back to you, and you go back to your tent, which is set up in the precincts of Jerusalem, and you roast the meat and have a big family celebration. So that's what it looked like when this event happened. Okay. Now, what's the stress? So the word God that I wrote in red is repeated 14 times. If you repeat something, as I mentioned, 14 times, that's 7 times 2. That is the main emphasis. The main emphasis of that whole section is God. The second main emphasis, which is then repeated 7 times, is the land that God gave you. So God and the land are the two emphases of this whole ceremony by using the literary style of repetitions of key words. The Rambam, in his guide, which tries to give reasons for mitzvot, says that this whole ceremony is because Moshe feared that those who became opulent and complacent might fall into vices of insolence and conceit and abandon all good values. So what the Rambam says in a very short explanation, he says, what's this whole ceremony about? It's Moshe, it wants this ceremony to focus on the fact that God gave you the land and God gave you the produce of the land, of the blessed land, and you need to acknowledge that, because people who become rich and complacent might become conceited and arrogant and abandon all good values. In other words, couldn't care less about expressing gratitude and acknowledging God. Where does he get that from? He gets it from the Chumash itself, and he refers us to the Parsha of Akev, which discusses exactly this. Now, here's the second methodology the Torah uses in order to stress themes. One is the repetition of the words, and this is called chiastic structure. We talked about this a number of times during the year. I didn't bring all of them. There are many, many in the Chumash. There are many structures like this, but every once in a while I'll bring one in order to demonstrate it. This is a good demonstration of a chiastic structure. Now, if you remember what a chiastic structure is, it's a structure in which you have a paragraph, the number of verses, and there's brackets. The first verse and the last verse form a bracket, and they reflect the same theme, but in different ways. So look at the bracket around this paragraph. The first one says, "Be careful you do not forget God your God and not do his commandments." And the last bracket says, "But remember God your God." In other words, the theme of the first and last sentence, the two brackets, are the issue of forgetting God, not acknowledging God, and the requirement, the opposite. But you have to remember God and remember that he is the one who gives you the ability to produce this wealth. Okay, then you have the second sentence, and you have the second sentence from the end. That's the second bracket, the internal bracket, which is line 2, and the second from the end, and that's in the blue. Otherwise, says Moshe, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build fine houses and settle down, and when your herds and flocks grow large, and your silver and gold increase, and all you have is multiplied, when all of this happens, when you're settled on your property, you're very successful, you're a successful farmer, you have everything that you want, your herds and flocks are fertile and they grow, your income is good. Okay, then what's the concern? Look what the connecting sentence is. You may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth. Where does all this great stuff come from? I did it myself. I did it myself. Those two lines are what the fear is that Moshe is telling the people. This is what may happen this is what the Rambam says. This is where the Rambam gets it. When you are wealthy and when you are satisfied, then you are likely to just take credit for yourself and say, it's my farm. I'm the one who put the work in. I'm the one who harvested. I'm the one who did business and are successful. So I don't need God. Okay, so again, look at the outer ones. The outer ones say, do not forget God, but remember God. Okay, but what will make you forget God? Well, it's the inner two lines will make you forget God. And then whenever you have a chiastic structure, the central theme is in the middle. So you have the brackets on the outside, and then the central theme is in the middle. What's the central theme of this paragraph? All of this is one paragraph in the Chumash. Then your heart will become proud, and you will forget God, your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. So what Moshe is saying, this is what I'm warning you against. You are going to become arrogant. You're going to become proud, and you're going to take personal credit for everything that you have, and you'll forget God. You don't need God anymore. right? But it's the God who brought you out of Egypt. It's the God who brought you out of slavery. And then Moshe goes on. It's the same God who led you through the vast and dreadful wilderness, that thirsty and waterless land with its venomous snakes and scorpions. He brought you water out of a rock. He gave you manna to eat in the desert, something your ancestors have never known. He did that purposely to show that he is the one who is supporting you. He is the one who's giving you water. He is the one who's giving you food. If you didn't have the water and food that God gave you, you would die in the desert. So God did this in order to test you, in order to show you what you need to be grateful for. Okay, that's what Moshe has said to the people in this paragraph back in the Parsha of Akev. Okay, and this is Moshe's fear of people who are successful and happy and satisfied, forgetting all their history and forgetting what God did for them, and forgetting that it's God who gives you the ability to produce this wealth. Okay, now how is this connected to the declaration? So let's look. The Bikurim ceremony, accompanied by its special declaration, was designed to counteract the pernicious effects of the material good life described above on the spiritual well-being of the nation. In other words, the Bikurim ceremony was directed to counteract the arrogance and conceit and the idea that farmers would take credit for everything that's successful and forget God and forget their history. While God wants his nation to enjoy the bounty of the land, in other words, God wants the people to be wealthy and successful and enjoy life and to feel blessed. He wants that. But they must retain the proper perspective and be conscious of the meaning and purpose of such blessings. So that's what's required. God wants you to express acknowledgement and gratitude. Once you do that, then you can enjoy all the blessings of the land that God gave you. Okay, now let's go in a deeper level of interpretation and look at that middle statement, that Arami Oved Avi, that middle statement that the person has to declare. What's the force of that statement? What's the theme of that statement? So let's look. We have another internal chiastic structure. The brackets around that statement, the first line is, my ancestor was a wandering Aramean. He went down to Egypt. There he became a great nation, but the Egyptians mistreated us, made us suffer. And then the last sentence in that declaration is, so God brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. He brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. That's the two brackets. And what's in the center? The center is, we cried out to God, and God heard our voice and saw our misery. And by the way, this tells you why the rabbis chose this paragraph to stick in the center of the Haggadah. The Haggadah is all about Yetziat Mitzrayim. It's all about the holiday of Pesach. But strangely, the Haggadah does not give the whole story of Pesach. It doesn't give the whole Parsha of Bo and Bishalach and all the things that describe Yetziat Mitzrayim. They don't say all of that. They condense the whole theme in this one paragraph, and that's what you say on the night of Pesach as a reminder of what the Pesach theme is about. The Pesach theme is, remember our history. We went down to Egypt, we became a great and powerful nation, and because of that, we were mistreated and enslaved by the Egyptians. They made us suffer. We cried out to God. God heard our voice. He brought us out of Egypt, and he eventually brought us to this land to give us this land flowing with milk and honey. That's the whole story. The whole story in 8 sentences. And that's the whole story of Pesach. That's what's said on Pesach night. And the key element in the middle is, we cried out to God and God saved us. We didn't free ourselves from Egypt. We're not responsible for our freedom from slavery. It's God did it for us. That's what we have to express gratitude for. That's why we're expressing this gratitude at the moment that we're bringing these first fruits. And now the person ends this statement by saying, and now I bring the first fruits of the soil that you, God, have given me. There's your declaration of acknowledgement. Then the instructions are place the basket before God, your God, bow down before him, and then have your party, have your celebratory meal with your family. What's the force of this declaration? First, the first recitation of this declaration in the legal language of a declaration focuses on the statement that God fulfilled the promise to bring the descendants of the ancestors of you, the people, into the promised land. So the farmer says, I declare today to God your God that I have come to the land God swore to our ancestors to give to us. So that's the first acknowledgement that God kept his promise to Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, and he kept his part of the covenant. The covenant, remember at Har Sinai, you listen to me and follow my laws, and I will give you this land that I promised Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. So God
Hey,
has given us this land. Yeah,
can I just ask, why does it say your God? Surely it should be our God.
I know. It's an expression. The Torah uses that expression not to exclude. Moshe's not excluding himself. He's focusing that this God, Yud Kei Vav Kei, the God of the Jewish people, is your God. There are no other gods. Remember, Moshe is always afraid that they're going to worship idols and have other gods, and they're going to be tempted to do all of that. I mean, he spends half the Torah, half of the book of Shemot, Vayikra, and Bamidbar, and Devarim saying that. So every time he talks to the Bnei Israel, he emphasizes that Yud Kei Vav Kei, the God of the Israelites, is your God, no other gods. So he
I,
uses your
I
God rather than
understand that,
our
but
God.
yeah, but shouldn't it be inclusive? So why doesn't he say our God? It
Again,
makes
because,
Yeah, but Steve and
yeah,
Rose, doesn't saying your God make it more personal?
that's that's what I'm trying to,
Emphasizing your personal relationship with that kind of, right?
no,
right.
no, because if I'm making a declaration, I want to speak to inclusively. It's like when we daven Yom Kippur, it's always us.
Right, it's true. When we daven, we include all of the nation Israel in our davening. It's always communal. But Moshe here has a different purpose. Moshe is teaching, he's still teaching the Bnei Israel, and he's warning the Bnei Israel, and he's giving the Bnei Israel direction and guidance. And so when he talks to them, he wants to focus that the God he's talking about, every time he mentions God's name, the God is your God. Okay, there's no question that it's his God too, but they're not going to make that mistake. Of course, they know the relationship between Moshe and God. But Moshe, in language, every time he speaks to them, wants to stress the point that this particular God, Yud Kei Vav Kei, is only the God of the Israelites. He is your personal God. So it's an expression. Every time he wants to mention God, he says, your God. Same thing we have in the Shema, right? It's God is your God. It keeps repeating the idea that God is your God. The idea is you have no other gods. So it's an expression that Moshe uses all the time. Okay, the second recitation is historical validation. So the first is a validation of the covenant. that God has kept his part of the covenant. The second part of the recitation is the historical validation. When we cried out to God, God heard our voice, saw our misery, saw our oppression, and he brought us out of Egypt. We didn't bring ourselves out of Egypt. We didn't free ourselves from slavery. God is the one who brought us out of Egypt. And then the conclusion is, and now I bring the first fruits of the soil that you, God, have given me. I acknowledge the fact, here's the gratitude sentence. I acknowledge the fact that you're the one who has given me the land and the blessing of the land, and this that I've brought you in this basket is to validate that I'm acknowledging it's not us. I'm not taking credit. That's what Moshe was afraid. The people will take credit once they become successful. So the person bringing the basket says, we're not taking credit. I'm not taking credit. I'm giving God the credit for the land and for the success and for the blessing of the land. And then the whole
Steve,
paragraph,
can I ask you a question?
yeah,
Well,
let
it
me
keeps
just finish
going.
the whole paragraph and
Sure,
ends
sorry.
by look down from heaven, hashkifa mimon kachcha min hashamayim, and bless your people Israel and the land you have given us as you promised on oath to our ancestors, a land flowing with milk and honey. In other words, that's the summary of this whole declaration of the first fruits. Yes, Tsupara?
No, I think what I'm struggling with is that, of course, none of this would have happened without HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's the source of our blessing. But shouldn't
Right?
there also be a little acknowledgement of that none of this also would have happened without each person's hard work to make it happen?
Absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely. That's
feels like
another
we're
story.
missing that.
No, that's another story. When we get to this, to understanding Pesach, I don't know if we ever had a shir on understanding the symbolism of matzah and chametz on Pesach, but that's exactly what matzah and chametz represents. Chametz represents the independence of the farmer. The farmer is the one who make the bread. God gave the wheat, but the farmer made the bread. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
On Pesach, we purposely want to not acknowledge our independence, but rather our dependence on God. Therefore, we have matzah and not chametz. Chametz is prohibited. But on Bikurim, if you look in the Chumash, when the farmer brought the Bikurim on Shavuot, he brought loaves of bread. You're not allowed to bring loaves of bread to the temple in any other ceremony. It has to be matzah. Every korban has only matzah and not bread. The only time you can bring bread is when you want to show your independence and the product of your hands and your work. And so there's nothing, I said that in the beginning, there's nothing wrong with God saying, I want you to have this sense of self-satisfaction and self and accomplishment as a farmer, that you've been a successful farmer on the gift that I have given you. God wants that. He wants that. But it has to be within context. Once you express gratitude to God, and once you say, I acknowledge, God, you're the one who gave us all of this, you're the one who allowed us to have a successful farm, then you can enjoy the fact that you have been a successful farmer. But it has to be within that context. Got it? That's why you bring bread
Yes,
on Shavuos, and you have a prohibition of any kind of bread on Pesach.
very good. Thank you.
Okay, so now support for the recitation. This was Hirsch now sort of summarizes all this for us. The recitation in our Sedra addresses in words the concern expressed in that first quote in Akev. Then your heart will become proud. You will forget God. who brought you out of Egypt, out of a land of slavery, you may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. And then you can forget God. You don't need God. So with this formal declaration, the bringer proclaims he has not forgotten that God brought him out of the nation out of Egypt into the land of blessing to fulfill the covenant. So by making this declaration, he's saying, I haven't forgotten God. He has not forgotten that the land was given by God conditionally, and therefore is not the nation's independent possession earned by its own efforts. In other words, the land was given by God. The reason that the people could overcome the enemy is because God was behind them and has given the land to Bnei Israel, and that's why they successfully were able to establish the tribal areas of Canaan and turn it into Eretz Yisrael. And thus the ideas expressed in the declaration parallel the concerns expressed by Moshe. In other words, Moshe said, you're going to forget God who took you out of Egypt. You'll forget God who gave you this land and the ability to be blessed. And by making this declaration, you're saying, I have not forgotten that. I have not forgotten that. And therefore, you've acknowledged God. The first fruits were taken. Now, Hirsch says, this is not about an individual farmer. It's not about one farmer coming from a farm. That's not the ceremony. The ceremony was a national ceremony, and it was a symbolic ceremony. Now, he makes this case. How do I know it was a symbolic ceremony? The first fruits were taken only from the Sheva Minim. The Sheva Minim characterized the blessing of the land. And the different fruits were taken from the areas of Eretz Israel which produced the best samples. So in other words, if not every farm brought 7 different species, because some species didn't grow where the farm was. So what happened was, if you lived on the coast, which was where fruit was grown. You had orchards, apple or different kind of orchards there, and on the Jordan where you had dates, palms and dates. So that's where you took the dates that were one of the Sheva Minim, and they were put in the basket. Then you had vines, and the vines were taken from areas in which grapes were grown best. And then you had wheat, and the wheat was taken from areas where grains were grown. So in other words, this was all the basket was a symbolic basket that was brought by a farmer in the name of the entire nation. It wasn't an individual thing. Okay, so the farmer had this basket of the different kinds of Sheva Minim that were brought from different areas in Eretz Israel by different tribes. Then clearly the symbolic, concrete nature of the fruit is stressed. The fruit symbolized the abundance and blessing of the land given to the nation as part of the covenant. It wasn't the personal farm of the bringer. He was bringing it as a representative of the whole nation. The ceremony was a national holiday during which participants represented societal groups, not themselves as individuals. In other words, the basket contained grapes or wine from a certain region, dates from another region, wheat from another region. It was a national holiday, and the farmers represented the national body. When they brought it to Yerushalayim, all the officials of the nation came out to meet them. And there's a whole description in the Gemara. I didn't bring the whole description, but there's a whole description that all of the officials, the government officials, the Sanhedrin, the Kohen, the king even came out and met the farmer and his whole entourage of musicians and cattle and a ox that was decorated with all kinds of colored ribbon that brought the this big basket in. It was a big national celebration. The farmers bringing the first fruits to the sanctuary, handing them to Kohanim, were acknowledging by this symbolic action of this symbolic basket, they were acknowledging, remember God, your God, because it was He who gives thee the ability to produce wealth and so confirms His covenant. In other words, this was a national statement that this farmer was making in front of everybody out loud in the name of the whole nation. So the summary of the national ceremony was that the farmer making this declaration declares the nation has not forgotten that God provided the land and the blessings which produced abundant crops. The nation has not forgotten that its very existence was due to God's miraculous interventions and personal care. The nation has not forgotten that God gave the land to them as part of the covenant that he made with Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, and with the people at Har Sinai. And so therefore, having acknowledged all these truths, the farmer speaking for the nation validates in the closing verse, remember God, your God, because it was he who gave you the ability to amass this wealth in order that you keep the covenant in the present, which he swore to your fathers. And that remains the eternal mission of the Jewish people. In other words, this Bikurim national ceremony was a ceremony that validates what the mission of the people is. Our mission remains, even though we don't have Bikurim and we don't have this ceremony and we don't have this declaration. We don't have any of that anymore because we don't have the temple. But the mission is the same. That is, here we are in Eretz Israel. We are in a sovereign nation. We produce our own produce. We live in a blessed land. And what we need to not forget is this is all due to the fact that God created the nation by taking us out of Egypt. God guided and educated the nation at Har Sinai and made a covenant with the nation. And everything that we have is basically is something that we have to acknowledge God for. We can't forget God. We can't say, oh, the the early pioneers are the ones who created the nation in 1948, and it's a national nation. We don't need God anymore. We did it ourselves. This ceremony of the Bikurim and us reading the Bikurim ceremony and remembering the ceremony on Shavuot is giving that message to us, is that despite we are a nation on our own soil as a sovereign entity, we still need to acknowledge and express gratitude towards God for allowing the reality of having this land and living on it. Okay, so this is, Hirsch's point throughout this is that we have to study all of these texts, and even though they are not existent because we don't do them any longer, but by studying them and pulling out the values and the teachings of each of these ceremonies, that's the whole point. That's what the Torah wants to teach us. Okay, now, just very quickly, there's a second declaration that follows immediately, and there is a theme of the second declaration, a theme and variation of the first, but it goes into something in more detail. It's this declaration of a thing called Ma'aser Sheni. Besides the declaration of Bikurim we have just learned, this is the second mitzvah to take place in Jerusalem. It's also, in other words, the Bikurim took place in Jerusalem, and so does this mitzvah take place in Jerusalem, and it's the only other ceremony that has a declaration attached to it. So it's telling us the themes are thematically connected. Just aside, there is no declarations made on any korban. When somebody brings a korban for a korban toda, korban ola, korban chatas, the person who brings it says nothing, and that's purposeful. because in the pagan system, when a person would bring an offering, they would talk. They would ask the god, they would say, I'm giving you a gift, I'm giving you some food, this is what I want from you. They would have a whole incantation that goes with bringing an offering, and the Torah prohibits any kind of incantation because it's a pagan custom. Here, the person understands the symbolism of what they're bringing, what the method is in their own mind, and they don't say anything. The Kohen doesn't say anything either. That's completely, all the offerings were a silent ceremony that was all symbolic. So what is the second declaration of the Maaser Sheni? So little background. There were three kinds of maaser. Maaser means a tenth that you take off of your income from your farm, your orchard, your fields during the 6 years of the farming cycle. Farming cycle is 6 years. The seventh year is Shemitah, where there is no farming. So everything happens in a 6 year cycle, then Shemitah, and then it starts a 6 year cycle again. So we all are familiar with Maser Rishon. That's the Maser that's you take Truma and Maser uh, every year on all of your produce. And that's what the Rabbanut does. It takes Truma and Maser and all the produce of Eretz Israel that goes into supermarkets and stores which have a tu'udah. If a store has a tu'udah, it means Truma and Maser, even though we don't give it to the Kohen or the Levi anymore because there's no temple, but it's taken off as a mitzvah, symbolic mitzvah that's still done to take off a tenth for the Levi, and Truma. It's usually a fifth. Doesn't say how much a Truma should be, but Truma and Maser are taken by the Rabbanut so that the rest of the food can be eaten. Okay, but there is what's called the Maaser Sheni. And a Maaser Sheni is not done anymore, but again, the whole idea is to understand its purpose, which remains an eternal teaching, a very valuable teaching. So a Maaser Sheni was another tenth, besides the tenth that goes to the Levi, and besides the Truma that goes to the Kohen. There's another tenth that's taken off for each year for the 6th year. It's called the second Maaser. And what's very unique about it is that in 4 of the 6 years, this tenth is put aside by the owner in his own bank account, as it were. He has to set aside a tenth of all the produce, meaning everything on his farm, all his crops, everything has to be a tenth of his net income has to be set aside for himself and his family. And here's the way the Torah presents it. Be sure to set aside a tenth of all your fields each year. Eat the tithe of your grain, your new wine, your olive oil, the firstborn of your herds and your flocks, in the presence of God, meaning in Jerusalem, at the place he will choose, so that you may learn to revere God, your God, always. In other words, it's supposed to be a spiritual experience. But if that place is too distant, if you live far away and you can't bring these animals and wine and olive and grain, I mean, it's a tenth of a produce of an income is a lot. So you can't take it physically. So you exchange the value of all of these things. You exchange it for silver. You put it into money and take the money with you and go to Yerushalayim with the money. When you reach Yerushalayim, says the next pasuk, use the silver to buy whatever you like. You can buy more cattle and sheep, or you can buy a sheep in order to make a barbecue, to have you have to have a celebratory meal in Yerushalayim with the money that you have set aside for yourself and your family. So you have to spend it on buying a sheep or a goat or whatever. You have to spend it on buying wine or other alcoholic drink. Beer they had too, so wine and beer you have to buy. and anything that you wish. It says anything that you want, but for your personal use. Then you and your household shall eat there in the presence of God your God and rejoice. In other words, you have to have a celebration with your own money that you spend in Jerusalem. The second tithe had to be festively consumed by the farmer and his family in Jerusalem and exchanged for the money that was spent on the first, second, fourth, and fifth years of the 6 cycles. So what about the other 2 years? What about year number 3 and number 6? So during the third and sixth year, this Maser Sheni was replaced. Instead of taking it and putting it in your own account, you have to take it and it's turned to Maser Ani. That is, it's an additional tithe for the poor. At the end of every 3 years, then you bring all the tithes of that year's produce and store it in your town so that the Levites who have no allotment, remember, Levites had no farms, they had no way of getting food. They have to rely on people giving them food from their farms. And the foreigners, the orphans and widows, those people who have no farms, they have no property anymore, they have no source of a stable income, you have to give a tenth of your income to them who live in your towns, those people who are in your community. You're not talking about giving it to other communities. You're talking about giving it to the poor in your communities so that God, your God, may bless you. In other words, if you give this charity, as it were, to the needy, then you will be blessed by God in all the work of your hands. In other words, God will continue to make you successful so that you can share what you have with those who are needy. So this is the way it looks. This is of the 6 year cycle. In year 1 and 2, it's the regular Truma and Maser. Every year is the regular Truma and Maser that you have to give, but the Maser Sheni is for yourself. Year 2, it's for yourself. Year 3, though, it's for the poor and not yourself. Then it repeats. Then Maser Levi, Maser Sheni is for yourself in the 4th year. Maser Sheni is for yourself in the 5th year, and then Maser Sheni is for the poor in the 6th year. So 4 years are for yourself, 2 years are for the poor, which Hirsch says is very important because what's the focus here? The focus is not on supporting the poor. The focus is on saving money for you to spend on yourself. Okay, now, by the way, this is not the 3rd and 6th year, and not the only times that you give money to the poor. You remember there are other laws. You have to leave a corner of your field. You have to leave things that fell down. You have to the leftover. You have to leave to the poor. There are a whole bunch of other laws about when you're doing harvesting, how you have to leave food for the poor. So this is not the only support of the poor. And the third category is you're supposed to give money to the poor as charity. So in other words, the poor are supported by you in many different ways, but one of the ways is this Maaser Sheni. What's your declaration? Now here, remember I said there are only 2 declarations. One is the Bikurim that we did, and this is the second declaration. This is what the person, now this is not a national declaration. This is a personal declaration of each farmer when they come to Yerushalayim. It doesn't have to be, by the way, on on Shavuot. It does have to be at the end of every 3rd year. Every 3rd year, you have to make this declaration. When you have finished setting aside a tenth of all your produce in the 3rd year, in other words, 2 for yourself and 1 for the poor, the year of the tithe, you shall give it to the Levite. In other words, the 3rd year, you have to give it to the poor, to the Levite, the foreigner, the orphan, the widow, so that they may eat in your towns and be satisfied. So when you have done a 3 year cycle, 2 for yourself and the third for the poor, you make this statement: I have removed from my house the sacred portion that I have given it. A sacred portion means it's Kodesh. The food, the tenth that you take off, the Maaser Sheni, is part of Kodesh, just like Truma and Maaser is Kodesh, so is Maaser Sheni Kodesh. So I have taken the portion and on the third year, and I have given it to the Levite, foreigner, and fatherless widow, according to all you have commanded. I have not turned aside from your commandments, nor have I forgotten. In other words, you make a declaration that I have, on this third year, I have given it to the poor. Then you make a declaration about the other two. I have not eaten any of it, referring to the Maser Sheni, of that you took for yourself. While I was in mourning, if I was in mourning, I couldn't go to Yerushalayim and use it, nor have I removed of it while I was unclean. If I was tamei, I can't go to Yerushalayim, nor have I offered any of it to the needs of the dead. I have not taken the money and used it to bury any relatives. I have obeyed God and I have done everything you commanded me. Now, what's this about? Why do you have to make this declaration that I haven't had this celebratory experience in Yerushalayim if I was in mourning, or if I was tamei, or use any of the money for the needs of burying a family member? Why do you have to make such a statement? So first of all, Hirsch says, let's take a look at each kind of tithe and see what it teaches us about the proper use of our wealth. Each tithe has a theme. For our spiritual life, that's the tithe that's given to the Levi every year. When we give tenth to the Levi, that is furthering our spiritual life, because the Levim served as the rabbis and the teachers. That was their job. In other words, they didn't spend that much time in the temple. There were lots of Levites. And so most of the time they were not in the temple, serving in the temple. Most of the time they were just living in the community with everybody else. But their role was to be teachers and spiritual leaders. And therefore, by supporting them, you're supporting your own spiritual life, because they are your teachers and leaders. Second, you have to further your own material well-being. That's the second tithe that's taken off 4 out of the 6 years. And you have to spend it on yourself and your family by feasting in Yerushalayim. And the third is the second tithe that's taken out for the poor. It's teaching you that you have a responsibility for the well-being of your fellow Jew, who is the poor, the orphan, the widow, the foreigner, who has no means of supporting themselves. So in other words, these tithes teach 3 ethical, moral uses of your personal wealth. You use a part of it for your spiritual life. Every time you enroll in some kind of courses to people who you go and you learn from, that's this value of furthering your spiritual life by spending some of your money on teachers and spiritual leaders, even when you support your shul and you support the matan or nishmat, the people who have public teaching. The second is furthering your own material well-being, is using part of your money on yourself in order to enjoy yourself. And the third is to help the poor, help the people who are needy whenever you contribute to any of these NGOs or organizations like Leket, or any of the number of people that you give money to. That's also a proper use of your income. And by having this special regulation of Maser Sheni, where you cannot use it if you are in mourning, or if you are tameh, or you're associating with the needs of the dead, you are not allowed to use this kind of money, that part of your wealth, for any of those things, because you cannot feast in Yerushalayim in a state associated with death, mourning, or depression. In other words, when you spend the money on yourself in Yerushalayim, you have to be in a sense of joy and self-satisfaction. You must feast with a sense of accomplishment, self-esteem, peace of mind, lack of guilt. In other words, when you spend money on yourself, you have to be able to say to yourself, I have spent money in a proper way. I have supported my spiritual needs. I have supported the needs of others. I have done what I'm supposed to do with my wealth. And therefore, I have a right, or I can, or I want to, or God wants you to celebrate with a sense of accomplishment, self-esteem, and peace of mind. In other words, if you felt, well, I really shouldn't go out to dinner because there are poor people I have to support. I really shouldn't go to dinner because there are other things I have to use the money for. What this is telling you is, don't think that way. Give a portion of money of what you should, and then enjoy yourself because you've done what you're supposed to do. And there's no mitzvah of living a life in which you deprive yourself. God wants you to enjoy yourself. So why the focus on Maaser Sheni? If we consider the prominence is given to the 4 of 6 years to this particular kind of Maaser, where you're spending it on yourself, the message is, although our spiritual and social duties must be discharged, that's giving money for your own education to your shul and so forth, and to the poor, it's most important to be able to state before God that we ourselves enjoy his blessings with a clear conscience, free of guilt or shame, without depression, without grief, without morbidity, but just enjoy ourselves by acknowledging God is blessing us. That is an important thing. It's within this context that we can satisfy our spiritual and social obligations with a free and open hand. And it reflects that little phrase in Pirkei Avot, Eze Ashir, who is somebody that feels that they are well off, Hasomeach Bechelko, that enjoys what he has. In other words, you're supposed to enjoy what you have. If you enjoy what you have, then you acknowledge and you express gratitude for God, and you are in the frame of mind in which you freely also support educational institutions, spiritual institutions, and the poor and the needy. Okay, that's
Thank you, Steve. Thank you.
that
Some excellent messages to start the new week with and to start the new year with.
absolutely something that when we take we take account at the end of the year, we have to think along these lines of how have we used our resources, and have we acknowledged and expressed gratitude for God. So that's true.
Thank you, Steve.
All right,
Thank you,
take care,
Shavuot
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
That was
you.
most uplifting.
Shavua tov, everybody.
Good job.